My husband demanded a paternity test. I refused, filed for divorce, and later discovered my own mother sabotaged my marriage for money. So, for context, my ex-husband 30 male and I 29 female separated 6 years back, 6 months after our son was born. My ex-husband and I had been married for a year and a half before that and had dated for 2 years in college. We went to different colleges, but we had a common friend, Dan Phi male fake name, who was responsible for setting us up together. I thought my ex-husband was just perfect in every way, so I didn't think twice before marrying him and having a baby with him. Things were going well for us, and we were ticking off things from our bucket list one after the other. We bought a house 1 month after our baby was born, and at the housewarming party, our friend Dan decided to get blackout drunk. He then pulled me aside and confessed that he'd fallen in love with me, and even suggested that we elope. He said that he was willing to adopt my son as well if that's what it was going to take, but he wanted to be with me at any cost. I was disgusted and repulsed by his behavior, so I immediately told my ex-husband and had him kicked out of our house. I thought that that would be the end of things, but after that, my ex-husband started acting really weird and distant. He started working late nights and would come home at odd hours, as if he was trying to spend as much time away from home as he could. He'd also started keeping his distance from our son, which was even worse. I finally confronted him about his strange behavior almost a week later, and at first he insisted that he was fine, but then he brought up what Dan had said at the party. He told me that he was finding it hard to believe that Dan and I didn't have a thing in the past because of how close we used to be. While it's true that Dan and I were really good friends back in college, we had grown apart after graduation. I was very offended that he didn't believe me, and I think it was the pregnancy hormones, but I lashed out at him for even implying that I'd been lying to him about something as sensitive as this. We ended up getting into a huge fight over that, and he demanded that we get a paternity test done for the baby to make sure it was his. Now, under usual circumstances, I don't think a paternity test is something to shy away from, and I had nothing to hide. But my ex-husband was essentially accusing me of cheating on him, even though I'd been nothing but loyal to him, and I literally had a baby with him. What more proof does a guy need? I didn't like the implications of what he was demanding and decided to end our marriage. If he couldn't trust me, then there was no point in staying together, and I didn't want to stay in an unhappy marriage. I had a son now, and I wanted him to grow up in a happy home. I didn't want to see my ex-husband at all, so I packed my stuff up that night itself and moved in with my mother. My dad had passed away from a lung disease years before my baby was born, and my mother lived by herself, so I figured that she'd be glad for the company too. She really was happy to have me over, told me I was doing the right thing, and was overall really supportive of my decision after I told her what had happened. The next day, I filed for divorce and full custody of my son. My ex-husband didn't contest either, and even terminated his parental rights. Within 6 months, the divorce was finally finalized, and that was that. I didn't hear from my ex-husband after that. I got $70,000 in the divorce settlement, which was just about enough for me to start a new life, a better one for me and my son. I resumed working a few weeks after my divorce had been finalized since my maternity leave was over anyway, and I tried my very best to work as hard as I possibly could without compromising on my time with my son. It was difficult to balance both as a newly divorced single mom, and the guilt was insane, but I powered through it all somehow. I stayed at my mother's place for the first couple of months, but then got an apartment of my own and moved in because I wanted to be independent, and also because my mom was getting old, and I didn't want to burden her by overstaying my welcome. She'd never tell me to leave herself, but I knew I had to get back on my feet somehow. So despite her protests, I still moved out and hired a full-time nanny to look after my son. That's how the first few years post my divorce worked out for me. Fast forward to 6 years later, I'm now living in a much bigger apartment and working in the same company in a higher position for a bigger paycheck. And I'm actually kind of proud of myself for achieving this now that I say it out loud. My son has everything that he could ask for, and I'm very thankful that I can provide for him. I've moved on from my failed marriage and have even gone on a few dates and had a few flings in the past couple of years. But that's about it. I haven't had any serious relationships after my divorce, despite my mother's insistence that I find a new husband and get remarried. I'm just not interested in being a wife right now and only want to focus on being a mother. It's just me and my son now, and I assume that that's the way it will be until I find someone I like and feel ready to get married again. But a few days ago, our lives were interrupted by the sudden reappearance of my ex-husband. I haven't heard from him ever since we got divorced, as I had mentioned earlier. A couple of friends had told me that he'd moved to Australia a few months after our divorce, and that was the last that I heard of him. So for him to suddenly turn up at my door was a huge surprise for me. I didn't even know he'd found me. But after overcoming the initial shock, I told him that I wasn't willing to speak to him and that he needed to leave. He said that he'd leave, but before that, he needed to apologize and explain his side of the story. I was hesitant to give him a chance, but I was also curious to know what he was here for, so I agreed to talk to him. However, I wasn't going to do it at home, especially not when my son was around. Since it happened to be the weekend, I couldn't talk to him back then, so we arranged to meet at a nearby restaurant yesterday. Yesterday, he finally talked about what had happened all those years ago, and boy, am I in a situation right now. He obviously started by apologizing to me and told me that he'd made a huge mistake. Then he said that my mother was actually the one who was responsible for our divorce. Apparently, after I told him about what Dan had said, and after he had kicked him out, she had reached out to him a few hours after the party had ended, and said a couple of things to him that I still can't wrap my head around. She was the one who told him that apparently Dan and I were a thing back in college, and she was sure of it. She'd also told him that she suspected I'd already had an affair with Dan, but now that Dan seemed to be in love with me, I was scared of breaking things off and had to resort to throwing Dan under the bus to get rid of him. My mother was the one who had fed my ex-husband all the bullcrap about me and Dan and made him doubt my loyalty, which is just insane. When I refused to agree to a paternity test, that just felt like an admission of guilt to him, and he hadn't been able to take that, which is why he left me. A few weeks ago, Dan had reached out to him on social media and sent him several screenshots of his chats with my mother, leading up to the day of the housewarming party where it all went down. My mother had promised Dan that she'd clear the way for him soon enough, and she promised him that I wouldn't be married to my husband for much longer. In return, Dan had promised to pay my mother $30,000 to make it happen for him. It was horrifying for me to realize that these chats were actually real because I knew that my mother would always sign her texts with an E, which was her first initial. So, they had to be real. It was no surprise that Dan had offered to buy my mother's help because he was a trust fund baby and was used to having his way all the time, which is what he tried to pull off here as well, but failed. As you guys know, I'm still not with Dan and haven't even spoken to him since the day he was thrown out of our party. I don't know why Dan chose to come out of the woodwork all of a sudden now, and neither does my ex-husband, but he's definitely turned my world upside down with this information. The more I thought about it, the more ridiculous it seemed, but it also added up. My mother had been uncharacteristically happy and way too supportive when I told her I was getting divorced. Even though she'd always leaned towards having conservative views, she'd also tried to talk about how she felt bad for Dan, and how that poor guy deserved another chance to make things right with me. But I'd always shut her down because I just genuinely didn't like Dan. He was fun in college, but he was an entitled man-child and definitely not my type. She'd also tried to set me up with a couple of her friends' sons after my divorce, and they'd all been the same. Corporate employees with a significant paycheck but barely any personality. I guess she wanted a rich husband for me. My ex-husband was doing well at the time, but we were nowhere near qualifying as rich. Even the house that we bought was being paid for by my in-laws, myself, and my ex-husband. It took the four of us to buy a small house in a decent neighborhood. So, we were comfortable, but we weren't wealthy, and my mother had always taught me that money matters the most. So, I'm not surprised that she did what she did. I'm just surprised that she didn't hesitate to ruin her own daughter's relatively happy marriage and deprive her grandson of his father for 6 whole years just because she believed that I needed a rich husband. When my ex-husband showed me those screenshots and the chats between Dan and my mother, I almost fainted because of how shocked I was. After a while, I told my ex-husband that I'd talk to him later, exited the restaurant, and then drove straight to my mother's house to confront her about what I just found out. I didn't beat around the bush and got straight to the point as soon as she opened the door. She tried to deny it at first, but I could see that she was getting really flustered, and eventually, she broke down and confessed that she had indeed agreed to help Dan out all those years ago because she was in dire need of money at the time. She'd been a stay-at-home mom all her life, and after my dad passed away, she had nobody to rely on and was struggling with the bills. The money that my dad had left her had been enough to sustain her for a while, but after that, it became really difficult for her to survive on the savings. She said that she'd thought about asking me to lend her money, but I had just purchased a house and had a baby, and I'd complain a lot about how expensive everything was quite often. So she felt like she couldn't come to me for help either. She had been looking for jobs for a couple of months, but had been turned down everywhere since she hadn't worked before. As a last resort, she agreed to help Dan, who had reached out to her a couple of weeks before the party. She'd intended to put in a good word for Dan after manipulating my husband to leave me, but Dan had jumped the gun. After that drunken confession of love, she couldn't salvage the situation anymore. She tried to, but it just didn't work, and eventually both she and Dan gave up trying. Even after that, she tried to set me up with rich guys, like I mentioned earlier, because she felt guilty about ruining my perfectly happy marriage for her own selfish reasons. But she had no luck with that either, and was now living with the guilt. She said that she did plan to tell me the truth at some point. but didn't mean for me to find out this way, and even tried to convince me that she'd done this for my own good because Dan was well off, and we never would have had to worry about money or work if I'd ended up with him. She said that she'd been looking out for me and requested me not to take this to heart, but I just couldn't believe that my own mother would do such a thing to me. I left, disgusted and horrified by what I knew now, and haven't been to see her since. I haven't responded to her calls and texts either because I just don't know what to say to her anymore. I've even told my ex-husband that I need some time to recover from everything that I've uncovered, and thankfully he's sensible enough to respect that. But my mother just keeps sending text after text every single day. I don't have the heart to block her either because my emotions are all over the place right now. Yesterday, I received a text from my mother that has hit harder than the rest. She told me that no matter what she'd done in the past, she wanted me to know that she still wished nothing but the best for me, but also wanted me to understand that she was her own person and had to watch out for herself too. She said that she did what she had to do to survive on her own, and she did regret it, but it was done now. She didn't ask me for help because she knew I wouldn't be able to help her since my ex-husband and I didn't make enough money to cover all the expenses, including hers. So what she did was out of sheer desperation. She has tried to make it up to me since, and will continue trying for the rest of her life if that's what it takes. That message really made me tear up because, like I said, I've spent my whole life with this woman, and in one day, my entire world was turned upside down. I'm just genuinely lost right now. Itia for not offering to help my mother when she was struggling with money after my dad passed away. Update 1. Hello. 4 days have passed since I posted. Thank you all so much for being so nice to me and for all the advice that I received on the original post. I'm in a much more emotionally stable state right now, and I'm thankful that I didn't respond to my mother before. I don't care what her reasons were. I don't care what she was going through. The bottom line is that she ruined my marriage, and she forced my son to live without a father for 6 years. I really cannot think of any way to justify what she did, and her trying to gaslight me into believing that what she'd done all those years ago for her own needs was okay, was the last straw. If she had told me what she was going through just once and asked for help, then I would have made sure that I helped her out and supported her in whatever way I could. But she chose to ruin my marriage just for money and thought that she could make it up to me by setting me up with her friend's rich sons. It's revolting to think that I used to put this woman on a pedestal and was actually even ready to believe that I was in the wrong. That's how convincing her gaslighting was. But it's okay now. I'm definitely not apologizing to her or letting her manipulate me anymore. After I was promoted, I'd been the one taking care of her, and she'd been living off of my money anyway. But that's all going to stop now. Once again, thanks to everyone here who took out time to reassure me that I was not the villain for not offering my mother help that I didn't even know she needed. For the ones who had been asking about why exactly Dan had chosen to speak up after so long, I spoke to a couple of my friends and found out that he was now a bitter alcoholic who'd been divorced twice in the past 6 years. So my best guess would be that he finally realized that I would never come running to him, no matter how lonely I was, and so he decided to stir up drama again. Or at least that's what I think happened. I'm not sure, and I don't think it really matters why he did it. He did it, and I still can't decide if the repercussions of that have been good or bad, a bit of both, I suppose. Update 2. So I finally blocked my mother on all platforms today, everywhere. I've also told my assistant to discontinue my monthly payments to her. I feel like a huge load has been lifted off my shoulders, and I can finally breathe a little now. It's been a really crazy emotional week, but I've made it through. My only concern right now is how I'm going to explain to my son why we're not going to visit his grandmother on the weekends anymore. I'm hoping he just doesn't bring it up at all because it'll be really hard for me if he does. I myself haven't yet fully processed the magnitude of what I've had to go through and what I've had to do, but I'll come to terms with it someday. I just don't want to put my baby through it. He's already had to go through 6 years of his life without his dad, and now he's looking at the rest of his childhood without his beloved grandma. It can't be easy, but it just has to be done. I can never go back to having a normal and cordial relationship with my mother ever, and that's something I'm absolutely sure of. As a matter of fact, I didn't even read the last couple of messages that she sent to me before I blocked her, because I knew that at this point there was nothing she could say to make me stay. I'm done, and I'm done for good. I wish my mother had loved me half as much as I'd loved her, and then maybe we wouldn't have been in this awful situation today. But she chose to do this to herself. She kept this huge secret from me for years, and then tried to gaslight me into believing that I was somehow at fault. It's just infuriating. And every time I think about it, I just find my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces over and over again. I feel betrayed and hurt and angry about what she did, but it's impossible to change the past, so I have no other option than to move on. And that's what I'm choosing to do now. I'm choosing to let go of my mother and all my resentment so that I don't have to carry it around with me for the rest of my life. I've also started looking into therapists near me because I strongly feel like that would do me a world of good right now, and I'm in desperate need of it. Because at this stage of my career in life, I cannot afford to break down or let myself spiral into depression, so I have to prevent that, and therapy is the best way for that, I've heard. Update 3. Okay, some of you guys had been asking about what I was going to do regarding the situation with my ex-husband, and I realized I'd completely forgotten to mention it, so that was my bad. Anyway, as for my ex-husband, I did get back to him, and we discussed what we wanted to do next now that the truth was out there. Getting back together was obviously out of the question because I'm not interested in rekindling any relationship with him. My mother's interference aside, he still abandoned me, doubted me, and picked an unnecessary fight with me, which eventually led to our divorce. He admitted that he'd been an idiot, but that doesn't really change anything for me, and I personally don't want any equation with him. However, he practically begged me to let him have a shot at being a dad because he did regret not being part of his son's life for such a long time. He seemed sincere about what he was saying, and I wanted to give him the second chance that I never received from him. It wasn't because I was suddenly feeling very kind, but mostly for the sake of my son, who often asked about his father, and I have to disappoint him with my response every single time. Now that he finally has a shot at having a father, I feel like both of them deserve a chance to have a real father-son relationship. Obviously, there are restrictions that I've set and rules that my ex has to follow. He can't just reappear out of nowhere and expect me to let him take over dad duties without testing the waters first. So, for now, he's only allowed to meet my son once a week and for a couple of hours only. Even those limited interactions have to be supervised, and he cannot take my son out without me. They've had 2 visits so far, and things seem to be going well. Surprisingly, my ex does get along well with my son, and within such a short time, they've built a good relationship. My son currently isn't aware of who this man is exactly, and all he knows is that he's fun to be around. But we'll phase him into the whole father thing slowly if things go well. My ex has said that he'll move back here when and if I agree to co-parent our son and let him have joint custody of him or at least visitation rights. I've told him not to get ahead of himself, but truth be told, it's nice to see them bond, and I'm thrilled for my son. I hope things go just as well for them in the future too.